So some of the basic, right, what are some of the basic takeaways here? Again, just to be clear, we all have biases in along different dimensions, height, weight, etc. Here we've focused on race. These biases, many of these biases are hidden to us, right? They're unknown, we're not aware of them. They do affect behavior, and they can affect behavior in ways that we're not only unaware of, but in ways that we wouldn't be pleased with if we were aware, depending on what our values are to begin with, right? So, sure. So before turning to the panel and the specific context of philanthropy, I just wanted to open it up for a few minutes to see if there are any questions. We could take 2 or 3 right now on sort of the research and what it's showing us, what it's not showing us, and so on. So any questions about this part for Johanna? Please?
Well, there was one leap that I didn't understand. When you talked about the kind of accusation and blamefulness, it seemed that wasn't based on some, you kind of said that you identified that with a history of things not working. And those words, you know, pejorative and negative sounding. But there's also kind of responsibility taking and things like that don't sound as negative. And I'm wondering what evidence you're basing that on, that is part of what doesn't work. I'm hearing that you are talking about some things that you see working by your students.
So what doesn't work in terms of the blaming and the...
Yeah.
Well, I could take a lot of examples from just kind of recent sort of controversial events.
Are those research-based? Is my question.
Oh, you mean research-based in terms of the blaming and the... no, I wouldn't say those are research-based. I'm just, I'm sort of basing that on looking at the way in which the media portrays, say, certain incidents that happen, where there's a racial incident and, automatically there's a big debate about who's a racist and who's not a racist, and was that a racist comment? And it seemed to me to just be very counterproductive because it's just a lot of denial going back and forth about, no, that wasn't racist, no. And then I think you do get a lot of sort of shutting down. Anyway, yes.
Sorry, David, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just take 2 more quick ones. There was one over here, right? And then we'll come back. Yeah, please.
Marcus Walton with the Association of Black Foundation Executives. We offer a racial equity training for folks in philanthropy, particularly focusing on Black communities via philanthropy. I actually had a similar question, comment around your statement of the conflict, to use my own terms. And I wondered if perhaps we're making an assumption that conflict isn't a part of a cycle of reconciliation, so to speak, and not necessarily a negative thing that we ought to eliminate from this process of enlightenment.
So I would say, and I think other people should weigh in on this, that I don't think we're trying to take away conflict. I do think we're trying to sort of remove the very, it just feels very polarizing, the way in which the discussion often goes around whenever race comes up. And it seems as if there's, it seems to me that, and when I'm watching what the debate is, it's always a debate about whether this person is racist or not. And when the situation came up with Crowley in the and Professor Gates, we sort of removed nuance from this altogether. And so it seemed to be that there's a discussion about, are we still a racist society? Is this individual a racist? When you're a white person and you're accused of racism, you start to not want to have the discussion anymore. And so I think that's what we're trying to get away from. I'm not sure that we're suggesting there shouldn't be conflict, because I think conflict is going, when the topic is race, chances are there's going to be conflict. And I think conflict can be very constructive. I think we're just trying to sort of get people away from a defensive crouch where they kind of go over here and someone goes over in that corner and you're not able to acknowledge any of your own biases because you're afraid you're going to be accused of something.
I just want to say for
so-
the record that we agree with that perspective too.
Yeah.
Our data shows that by focusing on the data itself, less on the individual and their racial bias or not,
Right.
we can have a more fact-based conversation that drills down to root cause and focus on policies that are discriminatory and have created disparities, helps us move the agenda that we all have in common.
And let's take one more. You had a question here? Yep. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I pushed this. Oh, thank you. I had a similar question about how do you then differentiate the conversation? Because there was sort of an assumption in the presentation that people aren't having conversations about race in a productive manner, therefore we need to make them have these conversations, and from that will flow other things. But I grew up in a household where we talk about race every day, and dinner table conversations. I mean, I've seen a lot of these videos because of being in my family circle or at the hairdresser or whatever, and we're talking about implicit racial bias, maybe not in those terms, but we are talking about it. So how do you differentiate for a group that has had those experiences but feels dissatisfied and does want to do something about it versus a white group who may be completely unaware of those conversations and they're starting from a different point and with a different position in the situation? So
Yeah,
where does that differentiation come in with the test and the process?
I guess I'm in favor of conversations and different types and meeting people in different places. We're really looking at, so I think if you've been having those private conversations or larger conversations, I didn't mean to suggest that those conversations aren't taking place. I think it's wonderful that they're taking place, and I would hope that those would be more available. And I think we sort of come from from a look at this from an institutional point of view as well. Can we start to have these conversations in, say, police cadet training programs? Can we have them as part of teacher training programs? Yesterday we gave a version of this presentation at a healthcare, and there was a lot of people talking about the need to have this kind of conversation or presentation or whatever, a kind of discussion among healthcare professionals. So I think our focus has been on some of these more institutional settings. But I think the more private, the more kind of conversations and nuanced conversations that we can have, that just makes it easier to have these conversations everywhere. So I didn't mean, I do apologize if I sort of implied they're not happening. I think they're not happening in certain institutional ways that they could be and they could be helpful.
Now, one thing that is clear and that Johanna made clear, but is probably clear to all of us anyway, is that there are obviously a lot of contexts in which these things can play out, right, and do play out, these biases. So whether it's about, the ambiguous situation of the kid who seems to be breaking a lock, who is breaking a lock on a bike in a park, is it his, is it not, is it hers, is it not, and what do we do? What's our interpretation of what's going on? How do we respond? That's a very different context than that of the jury deliberation room, right, in a murder trial. It's a different context than school recess and kids getting into whatever kids may get into. These are all, right, different contexts. There are many, many more, and the stakes are very different, and the decisions are very different. The Proteus Fund and the Equity Initiative that Tammy leads, of course, is especially interested in the philanthropic context, right, where foundations and non-foundation philanthropic actors are making decisions, typically subjective decisions, in a range of ways, not just as grant makers, and they have stakes attached. So that's where I'd like to take the conversation now. We have 3 people, wonderful people to help us do that. Starting to my far left, I have Amber Bradley, who is the Director of Assessment Tools at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, which provides funders with the data they need to fuel better performance on their part. Before joining CEP in 2010, Amber worked as a research and evaluation consultant with clients such as Mass Housing and Oxfam America. And before that, she served as program director at the MIT Community Innovators Lab, where she led partnerships with community groups, directed research initiatives, and taught about local economic and community development. So thank you, Amber.
Thanks for having me.
And next to Amber is Rasan Harris, who is, of course, the executive director of EPIP. He has over 10 years of experience working in philanthropy and nonprofits at a major foundation, namely the Atlantic Philanthropies, and at 2 community-based organizations. From 2003 until 2010, Rasan worked as a fellow and program executive at Atlantic, where he led diversity and racial equity initiatives and worked across Atlantic's aging, children and youth and reconciliation and human rights programs in the US, with an explicit focus on integrating social justice principles into grant making. Welcome. It's like you remember that, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, okay. And next to Rasan is Denise Porcher, who is the executive director of the Island Foundation. I'm purposely not saying a ton about what they do now, thinking that they may well bring in, right, their immediate experience in the context of this conversation. But Denise is active in supporting women's leadership and nonprofit capacity building initiatives. Prior to this position, she was a fellow at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, and there was much hugging and going on when these guys met up a little while ago at the Houston Institute at Harvard Law School, and was a member of the Harvard Diversity Working Group. She is a member of numerous boards which represent her interest in leadership development, social justice, and the arts. And really the 2 basic questions I'll pose to them, and then we absolutely will leave some time to open it up to all of you, is, what are some, where might we be able to see implicit bias, hidden cognitive biases, especially on race terms, right, play out in the philanthropic context? And if, insofar as we believed that, yes, indeed, based on our own observations, our instincts, whatever, these things are playing out, they're having an impact, something should be done, how would we do that? So literally how we do, and for us, this is definitely not, as I say, an academic exercise, but this is something that we are thinking about, right? And Joanna more than hinted at some ways we might proceed, but literally we're looking for some guidance on what is the second and third step that this program could take, right, to help to work with foundations, let's say, who really want to have this conversation and get to what might be a better place, right, in terms of their own operations. Okay, so let me start first with this basic question of how does this play out in philanthropy from your vantage point? Start with whoever wants to take it on. Denise.
And I will start with, say, I guess, a lesson learned and talk about my own bias. Johanna asked us to take the tests before we did this presentation, and it came out that I would strongly prefer white people. So like she said, that you're shocked, and then I looked at the screen and I'm like, well, how is this test designed? And I want to know about that. What were they looking for? So before I took the test and before I was really looking at implicit bias in philanthropy, I actually had a real life example. So about 2 years ago, I'm sitting at my desk and I'm going through hundreds of proposals, and you read cover letter after cover letter and they all look the same. And at one point I'm reading a cover letter, and in it there's a paragraph that said that the Island Foundation, it was very sweetly, nicely written, should take a look at why they give minority-led organizations a small amount of money. So this grantee was asking for $5,000. And we do give out some small grants, but they can vary. And she went on to quote this study and said that they found that a lot of foundations give small dollar amounts to minority-led organizations. And if we could just take a look at that and incorporate that into our thinking, and it was very nicely done. And it gave me great pause. I mean, that was something that made me stop looking at the stack and say, oh, what's going on here? I think about my own role in the community. I'm like, I'm active, I'm a social worker, I'm on all of these committees. Surely I know about this, and I have to know that this exists. And the woman that wrote that letter, she's a colleague and a good friend. And I just thought that that was really courageous of her to bring that. And, you know, I could have instantly sat there and said, oh, yeah, it's my board, and I'm going to go to my board and say, oh, we got to do something about this. But if I'm really gatekeeping a lot of that, what is it about my interactions with these groups, and am I really doing the best to look? During Johanna's presentation, she talked about the legitimacy of some nonprofits, and do we think people are competent to do stuff? So taking that test, thinking back to that letter, made me stop in my tracks about the work that I actually do. So sometimes I think just giving a real example of how this plays out can be more helpful than me just speculating on what could be.
This is a chronic egalitarian.
Rasan?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Rasan Harris, and my brother's name is Jamal. So on the implicit bias, I think we're in trouble. Also, took the same test, and I really, I think I have a little bit of self-hatred because I think I am biased towards white people positively more than black people. So I don't think it's the skin you're born into. I think it's a society that we're all born into, and the constant messages that we're bombarded with through the media, through our relatives, through our parents, through our friends. And I think it's, I really appreciated the attention, intention, and time components of taking care of implicit bias, because I think that's extremely important. I got to do a couple of commercials. First, I want to thank the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for creating this space. I mean, we're here at Harvard talking about implicit bias. I think this is an amazing thing, and this is something that I think should carry forward to all the places that we have influence, so that we can spread the conversation, make space for this. I also wanted to recognize the Proteus Fund for just being so great in the partnership. EPIP is a membership organization that's training the philanthropoids of the future, so people who work within philanthropy and are trying to move dollars for a more just and equitable and sustainable world. And we gathered a group of people of color that are interested in the field to come to Boston because of this workshop. So I think this is extremely powerful. And I want to take this moment to recognize our People of Color Network participants. Please stand up. Come on. So if you want to have a deep conversation about the resources that are out there within philanthropy, about where dollars are flowing, and some of the theorists and some of the data that's out there, please talk to them, because they've been steeped in it well this morning and be going hard in it for the rest of today and tomorrow. I'm also wanted to give recognition also to the Association of Black Foundation Executives, because as Marcus spoke, that affinity group actually provided our structural racism training for our gathering that we had in January. So there are resources out there that are practical, that get your hands on. So they might not be academic, but they're about moving the needle on these issues within the field. And one other thing I wanted to say is, in order to make sure that this conversation goes wide and broad, we need to make sure that people know about it. So hashtag EPIP, EPIP _PCN, again, EPIP _PCN, so that some of the things that are coming out here, we can hear each other and we have a louder voice. All right, now towards the specifics of how does bias show up in philanthropy. Quickly, how do we define success? If success comes from a certain perspective, then there are going to definitely be winners and losers, and I think implicit bias comes out of what looks like a successful program and what's not necessarily successful. Who sets the metrics? So thinking about what is, quality data and what counts as evidence and what doesn't. Who embodies intelligence and expertise versus who doesn't? Who even gets an invitation to step in the door of the foundation in the first place, and who never gets an invitation? I think there are little decision points about who we hold close to us, who we think is deserving of money, who we think would even understand these issues at a much higher level. That creates some haves and have-nots that directly affect how money flows in philanthropy. And just kind of through network theory, who you know helps you develop trust. And so therefore, it's easier to make a transaction with someone who you trust versus someone you don't trust. So therefore, if you do not have a very broad and wide circle and willing to take risks, and especially philanthropy, unfortunately, has been really risk averse, even though it's kind of like risk capital, but that's a whole other conversation. People end up making the same bets over and over and over again that flow along the same lines of board relationships and executive directors and staff. And I think being much more, paying attention to it, being intentional about, figuring out kind of how that's flowing, and then taking out the time to figure out to make a solution for it is really important if we're going to be able to address this within the philanthropic sector. And again, it's not about individual malice towards a certain population. It's just kind of the way we've been conditioned to figure, this is cute and cuddly and worth saving. This isn't worth saving because, this is violent, or this is lazy, or this is not pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. And I think it's really important for us to think about that as we're having conversations in philanthropy and as we set priorities.
Thanks. My name's Amber Bradley, and I work at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. I think many of you have heard of us. One of the things that we do is gather feedback from foundation stakeholders. We're well known for gathering feedback from foundation grantees. So I had a couple of cliches that I wanted to touch on, and a couple of data points. Don't worry, brought some. I think we've all probably heard these ideas that it's not what you know, it's who you know, and that people don't fund ideas, they fund people, right? So of course that idea of relational funding is real, I think, and very important. And some of what CEP's data has shown through our surveys of more than 50,000 grantees of foundations is that relationships are incredibly important. So the individual relationships that a grantee has with their program officer, in many ways that kind of embodies their idea of the funder. And so if a grantee experiences a strong relationship with their PO, they'll see a funder as effective. And it makes sense that really the funder's ability to be effective is created through those individual relationships. So I think first it's just important to think of how crucial those individual relationships are for effectiveness. Now, thankfully, what we've actually seen through all of these surveys is that grantees of color don't, and this is individual people taking a survey, so it doesn't necessarily speak to the focus of the organization or their leadership, but grantees of color don't tend to give different ratings of their funders in terms of how strong that relationship is. But we do sometimes see differences at individual foundations, and they're not always in the directions that you might expect. So there's a lot of nuance and complexity there. But I think the bottom line to that is that if you don't have a system in place to get that feedback from your grantees, then you don't know what's going on at your foundation and how your grantees feel about their relationships with their program officers and about the foundation's approach. So I think it's just important to think about, it doesn't have to be through CEP, but what are your ways of inviting those conversations and inviting that feedback? Now, another piece of data that we have that's really specific to the experience of race at foundations, and I think gets to the idea of implicit bias, is what I call the rule of three. So we've also done some research looking at trustees' experiences on foundation boards. And what we've seen is that when there are fewer than 3 trustees of color on a board, that those trustees of color who are there have a less positive experience. And specifically, they say that they have less influence over board decisions. So incredibly important when you think of all the foundations and all the money that's going out the door, that if we think that an approach of tokenism is going to be helpful, it's not. It doesn't work. And it has to be meaningful in order for people to have meaningful voice. And I think, maybe that is a cliche as well, but there's the data to prove that. So I think that's a question that everybody here can take back to their foundation. Do we have the necessary representation at the highest levels within our organization to have meaningful voice? And if we don't, what are we going to do about it? Last piece, I think, on the relationships piece for foundation program officers, that I think that because we see that that inroads to philanthropy are so often about personal relationships, that I think people need to just check themselves. So what are you doing as an individual program officer to build relationships, to seek relationships with leaders of organizations of color in your community, within your funding area? And who are you building the personal relationships with? And I think back to those questions also of who's seen as a legitimate leader. I worry in particular about the kind of explosion of the social entrepreneurship model, where often individual leaders are kind of handpicked and held up. Who's making those decisions? Who gets to define who's legitimate, who's a palatable leader, to be blunt, I think in many ways. And I think that those are the kinds of questions that need to be brought to philanthropy to really bring these issues up to the forefront.
So thank you. So I'm jotting down some stuff. Let me summarize some of the things that I got in terms of right where bias can enter, what the stakes might be. But I'll just focus on where bias can enter. So a lot of this really focused around it seemed to me around the grant-making role, right? So who gets grants, and going back as well to what Johanna was saying, I mean, what areas of work do we choose to work in? What programs do we choose to promote? How much, Denise mentioned the amount of money, not even just, right, the who gets grants, but how much do they get? A simple, straightforward thing. There are a whole slew of things around relationships, board relationships between program officers and grantees, which itself, right, is clearly the gateway to so much else that happens that will matter. Who's an expert? Who's recognized an expert or a leader in community, especially? What does success look like? Bursan mentioned evidence. What's this is a huge issue, right? Where evaluation is obviously so important for a lot of funders. So what is taken to be evidence of success or failure? And whom do we take seriously? But then, right, there are a whole, and some of this has been alluded to as well, there are obviously a whole bunch of hats and roles that foundations can play. So they're employers, yes, of staff, yes, of consultants, but also, right, there are any number of services, right, any number of vendors that foundations have to contract with. So how are those choices being made? Most foundations are investors, right? What kind of lens do they apply to their investments? They are strategic thought partners. They are conveners. They are, in many cases, in most cases, understood to be community leaders, right? So these are all roles in which issues of bias can play out and can be consequential. So it goes well beyond the grant-making role. I want to open it up. We have till 4, and I want to toggle between the folks here and the folks out there. And the specific question I want to ask really is, let's assume for the sake of argument that we had, right, that we took another step or two forward along the lines that Johanna was suggesting at the end, that we have some interventions, we can not only sort of introduce this research literature and talk about what we know about the pervasiveness of bias and its behavioral impacts, but we can even go a step further into implementing some of the interventions in a foundation context, let's say, or philanthropic context. Still, there's a question, right, about, well, how do we get this work in front of the people who would need to embrace it, right, to have a chance for it to move something in the foundation world? And I'd love to hear your thoughts about some specific ways that could happen, either at the individual foundation level or at the sort of community of foundations level, or any other level you think is appropriate. Yes?
I just had a quick question. Rashawn has some very
He's powerful.
questions,
Absolutely.
right? Very powerful and cogent cutting questions, really. And I don't remember your name, but from the Center of Effective Philanthropy.
Amber, yep.
I'm sorry,
Amber Bradley?
Amber. You started down a path that I thought was gonna, in your first example, was gonna piggyback on some of those questions as related to the perception of the grantee and whether the grantee was effective. What I thought I heard you say was, and go on to explicate a bit, was about how the foundation and the program officer was seen as effective or not effective. I think that's important. My question is, do you all have research, and have you asked the research question that goes along with the questions that Rasan asked? Because, I mean, it's great to know if you're effective or not, but whether or not you're effective or perceived as effective, if those other questions aren't asked about how you're seeing the grantee, the people soliciting grants. You know, so I just want to know, do you have that information? And it's not a criticism, but I think that's one space to have a contribution, to ask this other question and to get data around and narrative around that. So do you have that? Because you didn't mention that.
Right, the short answer is no, we don't. And I think that in taking the implicit association test, I think one of the ideas that came to mind was, wouldn't it be amazing and interesting to see how funders think about grantees? And, you know, if you could hear some of the descriptions that I hear when I walk into some boardrooms of how people characterize grantees in such pejorative ways, I think it's really eye-opening. And of course, that's not the rule, that's the exception. But I think that that's not necessarily along the lines of race. I think it's about a different kind of power dynamic that's inherent in philanthropy. But I think it's a great area for further research. But the short answer is no, we don't have that at CEP. Yeah.
If I could piggyback on that really quickly, I mean, I think one of the problems, and I probably get myself in trouble by talking too much, but I'll do it anyway, is that success within the philanthropic world is defined very nebulously, and it's almost kind of self-defined. So there isn't a very large incentive to figure out of your grantees who's been successful and who's been a failure, because on one end, if you have a bunch of failed grantees, you've made a bad choice with your money and you're not being an effective organization. On the other side, telling a grantee that they're not being that effective also means that you're insulting someone that you collegially kind of like. So I think philanthropy is a very nice field where people don't necessarily speak truth to power that often about making hard decisions about, this is what's going to cut off, this is where we're moving on, this is exactly what you need to do in a way that's not paternalistic, but dynamic, that comes up from the grantee organization and also down from the grantor. And a couple of organizations, I think, try to lift that conversation. The NCRP, which stands for the National
Committee on Responsive Philanthropy.
National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy. And I think to a certain extent, CEP talks about it from trying to get some peer comparison, because in their survey, you see what your grantees think of you, but you also see how they rate your peers in a similar class, so that creates some kind of accountability. But the whole sense of accountability within the field of philanthropy is something I think that is still in formation. And it'd be important to try to change that culture if we can move the needle on this conversation, but the larger power imbalance that exists between people who give money and people who are seeking money.
So let's go just back here, and then I'll come back to you, sir. I think you have to hold it.
I'm gonna hold it the entire time.
Is that right, David?
I'm gonna have a sprained finger
No.
at the time. I know a lot of people here, but for those who don't know me, my name is Travis McCready. I'm the Vice President of Program at the Boston Foundation. And I want to give a couple shout outs before I give some reflections. First, thank you to the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute and to Harvard for hosting this conversation. I very much personally feel a cascade of emotions and thoughts that came out of this conversation, and I personally feel that you've created a space for a conversation that philanthropy has been chomping at the bit to have. Secondly, I want to give a shout out to my colleagues from the Boston Foundation. You should know that there are 15 people here, 16 people here from the Boston Foundation. And part of the reason why I feel that's important is because to my colleagues, I feel like this has been something that we've been trying to have a conversation about at least for the 9 months that I've been back at the foundation. We've been trying to find an entry point into having this conversation vis-a-vis what's happening at TBF. So I'm going to be the guy that sort of maybe releases a little bit of oxygen for us to ask the questions that I know are on your minds and make the comments that I know are on your minds.
You go, Travis.
So if you just indulge me for like 3 minutes, because I have a lot of stuff I want to just get out on the table. But the very first, I guess, meta level question that I have to respond to your opening question, which was how do you diffuse this conversation in philanthropy? I want to suggest one challenging gateway issue, which is, to quote David Swenson, who's sort of the godfather of portfolio management, of endowment management. David Swenson once wrote, and my foundation colleagues, I say this all the time, but David Swenson once suggested that when making decisions about endowment management, casual commitments invite casual reversals. And he said that in the context that you have to have a rigorous analytical framework for making investment decisions when you're sort of managing your entire endowment. And I do feel that foundations are very much the same way, that we suggest to the outside world, we suggest to our grantees that we have this very rigorous analytical framework by which we make the choices that we're making, that we make the choices of investments that we're making, because foundations, philanthropy at the end of the day, it's an investment decision. And by suggesting that we have this implicit bias, which is just eating away at our rigorous analytical framework, it erodes the entire foundation of what we're doing. So the gateway question that I would suggest to you about proliferating this conversation throughout philanthropy is that. How do you maintain the integrity of of foundations, what we think that we're doing, while at the same time addressing our humanity, which is we all have these implicit biases rattling around in our heads, plural. I think that you guys, you focused on some of the obvious implicit biases, but I guess without throwing all of the foundation's dirty laundry in my thoughts out let me suggest that there are dozens upon dozens of minor but equally important implicit biases. So for example, take a look at an annual report of a foundation. Overwhelmingly, you will see that black people are the grantees, grant recipients, the community, or what have you, and that white folks are the donors, that does not mean that there aren't any black donors. It doesn't mean that white folks are not grant recipients, right? But when you take a look at our public material, it would suggest that overwhelmingly we give to black people or people of color, and white people are the ones that are giving the money. Implicit bias. Take a look at the way that we manage our endowment, okay? For example, and Orlando, I've told you this story before, so I'm not going to go into the details of the story, but let me just suggest that any foundation that has any black fund managers, and I challenge you to find any black fund managers in the portfolios of any foundation. But if they are brave enough to have gone down that road, you will find that those black managers are categorized under the emerging manager category, regardless of assets under management. Regardless of assets under management, they would be categorized as emerging managers, not as part of the regular management portfolio, right? Implicit bias. And so I mean, I have a laundry list of stuff that I could share, but what I would just challenge you to the second part of this gateway question is that I find interesting is
Gotta go 20 seconds now, right?
why are we
20
holding
seconds.
foundations, it appears, to a different standard in this implicit bias conversation than we would hold the private sector? Because every one of these little things that I've got down here should also be something we should be holding the private sector to as well, right? So I wouldn't suggest that this conversation about implicit bias is just for philanthropy. It's gotta be, and you really want to proliferate the conversation, invite our private sector brothers and sisters to have this conversation as well. So I'll just stop here.
Travis, thank you. We'll talk to you. You're going to talk to a lot of people. There was one question here and then here.
Hi.
In fact, we only have 10 minutes. Maybe we can go a little over. So let me take a few questions and then ask folks.
I will be real brief. I was a program officer for 7 years. Thought I had found my
I'm sorry,
dream.
what was your name?
Lois Smith.
Lois Smith.
Yeah,
Okay.
and
Thank you.
thought I had found my dream job. Loved the work, loved being in the community, loved the nonprofits, all the work that they do. But what I was confronted with on a pretty regular basis was implicit bias. The kind of thing that I would hear in the meetings. Well, I know that I'm privileged, and this is white people saying this out loud to me in a room. And so my reaction was, of course, one of, okay, I guess there's no question on where you're coming from. But yet, our philosophy was that we're open and inclusive, and oh my God, I'm not a bigot. We even went to anti-racism training, but that didn't do any good. So I guess the frustration of myself being in that situation where I'm kind of the broker, I'm in the room hearing those comments that you just said you heard, I heard them, brought it back to the leadership, but nothing was done. It didn't feel like it mattered. So it's kind of like, well, do you really want to have this conversation or not? So I've since left that organization, and it's even less diverse. I mean, the board is particularly almost all white. The distribution committee is all white. And again, it's not necessarily about race, it's also socioeconomic, because some of the comments that were made was, what kind of proposal is this? Why do they need to have a bus to take families to a picnic in the summer? Well, because a lot of families don't have cars, and this is a community building activity. So I just got tired of trying to explain that away, and I feel like some of this training should really be directed to boards at philanthropic institutions. It's almost like it must be, you've got to do this.
Let me take a few more questions, and then we'll have each of you say a closing word and respond to any you'd like. Okay, so let's go here and here, please.
Hi, I'm Jamie Jen Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of Border Crossers out of New York City. We do racial equity training with teachers, and we partner with schools to create initiatives for racial equity within their school community. I guess I first have a plea, which is that we don't forget the soil that we're on and how much we're not in this isolated moment, that all of the things that we're experiencing, and I think that we were alluding to this, are built off of the fact that this country was founded, and on this soil we've constructed race to define humanity and citizenship and manipulated it over and over again to do that. And so I just plead everyone to not be naive and to play naive. Okay, so that's my plea. And then my second is a question about the strategies and the interventions that were presented, because to me, I worry, because it seems like it seems like they're not necessarily for people of color. It seems like they're mostly for white people and for privileged white people. Again, painting with brush strokes as racism does. But so I worry about adopting something like that into the philanthropic community as an intervention, because, for example, I don't want, when people see a stereotypically Asian American character on TV, to have to think about me, or for me to have to represent that in order for them to change their bias. And I also don't necessarily want to be the person that they invite into the room to tell them, and I actually am in this a lot because I'm an Asian person showing up for the conversation about racial justice, which is often then so this whole other level of tokenization. So I would just question also, again, are our strategies led by the people who are affected by the
No,
most.
no, no,
And,
no,
yeah.
no.
I think
Wait,
that's,
wait.
I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry. I'm sorry. I just
And
want
I mean, yeah, and
I want to go around first.
I mean, but
That's
really
the
that is my
appropriate time.
question, which is that I know that, you know, race and class and is so clearly tied in this country, but, you know, we have to start separating that, and we have to, and especially in the philanthropic world, I think the sector is a really interesting way to do that, to have it led by people of color, to have it led by people who haven't had their voices in the room, and to not try to adapt our voices to theirs, but actually create the space. So that's basically it.
Thank you. So let me go here, and then there was one over here. No? Yeah? Let's just have these two, and then the panelists, please.
Thank you. I'm Sylvia Farrell-Jones. I'm president and CEO of YW Boston, which is an organization that works on racial equity and gender equity. And I just wanted to comment, we have an interracial dialogues program that's curriculum-based and facilitated and requires a diverse group to work, that we have been doing in neighborhoods for some time and now doing in schools between parents and teachers. And we're also now expanding it into healthcare settings, and we would love to do it within the foundation world as well, because the decision makers about the philanthropic funds being distributed and invested need to, I think, have a process of discovery. I will add that we've done this dialogue series within our own staff multiple times, and it's not only the white people who discover their biases.
That's right.
Everybody has them, and I think the two panelists who talked about the implicit association test, you know, I've read the book about it, we all have them. So we shouldn't be, I mean, we don't know, but we shouldn't be surprised that we can all learn from this. But we'd like to take this program widely throughout all kinds of institutions.
Thank you. And then here.
So I guess I don't know if I necessarily have questions, but my name is Stefana Stokes from Access Strategies Fund. It's a family foundation, and I am what we call a grants manager or program officer, if you will. And in the context of where we are in this space at this moment, I so appreciate the time, I appreciate the presentations, and I feel as if, although we've had the conversation about racial biases, it's almost as if we have not, and I don't think I've heard anyone on the panel or even with the questions say that there is racism within philanthropy in the context of how it is presented or how decisions are made. And I think if Travis had a few more moments, he would have went all the way in with that conversation. I think that, you know, I've heard, you know, and I so appreciate being at Harvard. This is my first time ever sitting in a chair in Harvard, other than watching Oprah when she was here not too long ago. And I love it. And it feels really good, and I feel privileged to be in here. But, you know, we're not talking about, like I heard you talk about behaviors, about guilt, and that's from the perception of you being the quote unquote targeted person as being defined as potentially being racist. But there's a realness in the presentation of someone presenting a contextual implicit bias that they don't know what that effect is about how a person who is the target responds to that, and that's really real. So I think when we broaden these conversations around racial biases, being disempowered as a person of color within philanthropy, that you try to bring everything that you are to the table, I think expanding this context in a way where grantees have, or even researchers are able to include all the things that I just think that I'm the only one that's probably not as excited about what we're doing in this moment, but I think it's a great moment, and open it up a little bit more broadly and call, sometimes we have have to say a spade is a spade, and it lives within philanthropy sometimes.
Thank you. So first over San, can we go 5 minutes over? Okay, so we're just going to 5 minutes where folks have a chance to respond to some of that. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to take any more questions because we're almost out of time. But let me start with Johanna and move this way for some closing short remarks.
I'm having a really hard time figuring out which person I'm going to respond to or which question. But I think I'm going to try to sort of address your comment about strategies, and I'm hoping I'm going to get to some of what you were saying as well, which is incredibly well taken. I think that these strategies, and I try to kind of convey that, are really the very nascent beginnings. This question came up over and over and over again as we looked at the research on implicit bias. It's like, what are people doing about this? What are the applications? And they were so thin, and they were so not available, and they were so not tested, and people were kind of on their own figuring it out. That this was the first time we'd kind of ever seen anything that had actually been sort of each one of those. And I agree with you, some of them seem a little lame, or they seem a little babyish, or they seem a little not so, but each one of them has actually been tested in some form and does seem to be effective in some way. But I want to say that I really welcome the kind of feedback that you gave about which strategies seem to be, maybe misdirected or maybe not such a great idea. And that as we kind of test these out, that's exactly what I'm hoping will happen, is that we'll start to figure out, we will start to expand this conversation. We will start to not have it simply from the perspective of the white person who feels guilty. And we will start to sort of figure out what we can kind of, what strategies really do work from a much broader. But I think, we really have to, this field in terms of the applications is really, wide open and brand new. And we will hopefully start to make those kind of, and everyone will start to make those kind of assessments. In terms of this conversation shouldn't be limited to philanthropy, we totally agree. This is like across the board. So we're trying to kind of, we recently did this for the courts. We're really, we did it from healthcare professionals. We're really looking at how we can start to have this conversation kind of in every field, because I don't think there's a single field that doesn't need to have this conversation. So thank you, but thank you everyone for like incredibly thoughtful and helpful comments and feedback.
Johanna, thank you. And Denise.
Hi, when I was first asked to join this panel, and I said implicit bias, how about the explicit bias? We didn't even get through that first in philanthropy. And you talked about, the Boston Foundation, you talked about your laundry list. Here's mine. And just in the interest of time, I can't even go through exactly what you were feeling, working in philanthropy. And when you talked about being a program officer, when you talked about integrity, those were all real issues. I mean, I go through that every single day. I think I was talking to Andrew walking over, I said, it's not just about implicit bias, what we go through. I said, it's about the power dynamic. And I said, and it's about wealth. That's its own animal. And when you enter into the foundation world, for many of us, it's like, whoa, what is this? And getting that understanding. So it's really layered, it's really complex. And I would say, at least today, I can walk away with a tool. Maybe I walk away with some validation that this laundry list has a basis. It's coming from somewhere, so that maybe you don't walk away after being a program officer for a few years. Maybe you can hang in there and make the changes. And I think going back to our respective foundations and maybe just practicing and calling the question. So if something comes up with a grantee, you say it's a minority-led, and they're benchmarking it with another organization that's not minority-led, maybe you bring up the study that I referenced earlier. Maybe you say, well, why is that? I think having the courage to call the question is how we can begin to have a little tool to crack implicit bias.
The racial history in the United States calls for some kind of reconciliation authority, healing. And I think some of the comments around the room kind of make that very explicit. And when you're trying to move this issue forward, it's hard to hold all of that together. Like the healing that we need, the the tough conversations and making people uncomfortable, and then trying to do something productive altogether. So I would just say that it's important for us to stay in dialogue with one another. And I see the significance of having a conversation here as being important, because it's not just in, my home with my parents. It's actually out in a broader stage. And the more we can expand the conversation in a way that shows that there's opportunity and create new definitions for success in this, American endeavor, then I think we'll be successful. So to what, Travis was saying in regards to it's in everything that we do. It is how you measure success and who your vendor is, who's managing your money, who you're giving a grant to, who you're going to hire, who you're going to bring to speak in front of your board. It's all of those different things. And it's bringing a standard of success in philanthropy that's no different than standards of success that we would put in any other realm. And I think it's finding ways for us to have a common language of trying to move equity forward and bring it into different spaces where it hasn't been before. So how can you join up? There is the D5 conversation within philanthropy. That is a industry-wide conversation. It started as the Diversity in Philanthropy Project, but it's D5. And it's talking about bringing this conversation of equity into a lot of different corners of the work. If you're talking about women and money managers of color, ABFE, Association of Black Foundation Executives, has done conversations on that we actually brought as EPIP to our national conference, so that we're pushing the question forward. There are people who have best practices that have brought in different vendors to deal with the other 95% of the money and what's happening with it. So it's pushing forward on that. It's actually EPIP and ABFE and Asian American Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, the Women's Funders Network, Funders for Gay and Lesbian Issues or LGBTQ issues. We're all doing a unity summit together right before the Council on Foundations in June of 2014. So that's a show of us all taking this issue of equity forward together. So there's movement within the field and different pockets of folks that are trying to get their acts together. I'm not trying to say, well, you were more oppressed than I was and I was more oppressed than you were, but just all trying to come together and move it forward. And I think it's important for us just to create an environment that comes through communications on social media and broader messages that creates the public will for the space for these dialogues. And on a very specific level, shout out to EPIP Boston. Nikisha, you want to stand up? If you want to be part of a local EPIP conversation on this work, we'd love to have you. You should see Nikisha. Our chapter here is fantastic. And just thank you for this opportunity.
Amber.
I know we're short on time, so I just want to say that I'm so excited to continue this conversation, hopefully with everyone here at some point and in some way. If you have ideas about ways that CEP could do more and better to help forward this conversation, please get in touch with me. Let me know. We do surveys not just of grantees and board members, but of foundation staff. We do that on an individual funder level. So, Travis, you and I can talk about that later. But I think, there's also opportunities for us to do those kinds of surveys more broadly. So if it's the kind of question where that diffuse voices from many funders brought up through research through CEP could be really helpful for raising conversations in ways that don't make us trip over our personal context and making sure we want to keep our jobs, we can try and help with that. So please get in touch if you have ideas or requests for how we steer our work. We're a nonprofit, so we do the work that the field asks us to do.
My hope in a year is to have taken a step or two forward that will doubtless be woefully inadequate, open to all sorts of criticism, and we will absolutely invite that. That's right, that's the messy way through. Right now, I just want to thank, first of all, EPIP, not only Rasan, but two of his colleagues that I think aren't here, right? Kate Seeley and Emily Kessler, who were super, super helpful in putting this together, as well as my colleagues, Johanna and David Harris, Johanna Wald here, both for the work that they do for setting up this venue. Their colleague Susan Eaton, I love Susan Eaton, there in the audience, and for as Johanna suggested, their work goes well beyond certainly this particular piece, and even the implicit bias. They are absolutely, with a meager staff of three sort of main folks, and then a small, additional staff to help them. They're doing tremendous amount of work on this and other issues. I want to thank my colleague Tammy Dowley-Blackman there, who again has led this work and will lead our expansion of this work into the future. And of course, I would like to thank you for making the time, for your passion and energy for this. And I think there will be a communication from us to you, because I think we have your information. It's not an NSA thing, it's just our thing, but we have your information. We'll be reaching out. And really, this is something we want, conversations, and obviously a different kind of conversations, and conversations are important. We're looking for, right, something quite specific, right? Something that will go perhaps beyond many of the conversations, at any rate, that have been happening to possibly changing the way some foundations at least choose to do their work. That's our goal. Thank you for coming. Help me to thank these folks for presenting to you.